Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff. We're here now to finish up the 28th chapter with the flowering plants. Please make sure you have your notes ready, your textbook nearby, and a pen and or pencil for drawing purposes. Upon completing this portion of the chapter, you all should be able to summarize the features that distinguish the flowering plants from other plants. You should also be able to briefly explain the life cycle of a flowering plant and describe double fertilization, which should be part of your homework. I repeat, you should do your homework, and in that homework include a description of double fertilization. And additionally, you all should be able to contrast monocots and dicots, those two largest classes of flowering plants, and we'll end things by discussing evolutionary adaptations of flowering plants. Let us begin. So as I ended the last part of this chapter, I ended by stating that flowering plants are grouped as angiosperms and members of phylum Anthophyta. So as they are the most successful group of plants on Earth. And yes, they even surpass the Gymnosperms, the naked seed plants. So as they have adapted, the flowering plants live, I would say, everywhere on Earth, and being so numerous that there is an estimated over 300,000 species of flowering plants. So as I state that, when I see plants turned in for a plant collection that are unidentified, and someone may ask, hey, what plant is this? It's quite difficult to know, because of course, the sheer diversity of phylum Anthophyta, but in the very same way, living here in the southeastern United States, many of those plants that you all bring in, I have seen before and have a bit of knowledge of. So with that, these plants come in a variety of sizes, shapes, forms, and being that called herbaceous, and even to those things that are not herbaceous at all, and those being woody, being the woody dicots. So some flower plants, being the tulips and or roses, have those large conspicuous flowers, others of which have small, inconspicuous flowers, such as the oaks or even the grasses. So keep these things in mind as we learn further about the flowering plants. So as it does state that the angiosperms reproduce sexually by forming flowers. They have double fertilization and form seeds. These seeds are form class within fruit. As I continue, also keep in mind that the fruit protects that developing seed, and often that fruit aids in its dispersal. So as those animals eat those fruit, they're being dispersed from point A to point B. Keep it in mind that the seeds are dispersed in such a way. And the flowering plants have efficient water-conducting cells called vessel elements in their xylem, and of course sieve tube elements in their phloem. The former being, of course, the reason they call it hard wood. So these flowering plants are essential for the survival of mankind. So the flowering plants are extremely important to us because I would say everything that we do is dependent upon the flowering plants. Say everything, I do say everything. In fact, the food we eat, if you've eaten anything today, which I hope that you all have eaten by now, duly note that it came from a plant. What type of plant? A flowering plant. So examples of which include things such as the citrus fruits, which I notice in the backyard of I have hundreds of flowers in my citrus fruit tree. And I just say hundreds. I had no idea that satsuma tree, which is about 3.5 feet tall, would have so many flowers. Apples, beans, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, wheat, and rice. All of those are just a few examples of the way in which we depend on these flowering plants. Woody flowering plants, such as the walnut, the cherry, or even the oak, provide valuable lumber, not to mention a bit of mesquite for smoking, of course, of meat, if you happen to eat meat. So these flowering plants give us fibers. You say fibers, you dang right I do, such as cotton. It is the fabric of our lives. And linen, medicines, and of course, medicines such as digitalis and even codeine. I think you all have very well heard of codeine before. And products such as rubber, tobacco, and coffee. You gotta have coffee. Chocolate, wine, and even the aromatic oils for perfumes or toilet water, as some may say. So economic botany is a subdiscipline of botany that deals with plants of economic importance. So if this is something that you're interested in, I said you should pursue it. So let's go to monocots and dicots, or eudicots. So phylum Anthophyta is divided into several small classes and two very large classes, known as the monocots, class Monocotyledon, and the eudicots, class Eudicotyledon. And yes, it's Monocotyledon and Eudicotyledon. So that represents the vast majority of angiosperms. It says approximately 97%. So what we'll do here is contrast these two. So the dicots includes an approximate 200,000 species, as opposed to the monocots having an approximate 90,000 species. To give you, I guess I'll say, a glimpse into the diversity of those two major classes. So monocots includes things such as the palms, the grasses, orchids, irises, onions, and lilies. Monocots, by and large, are herbaceous plants, mostly herbaceous, with those long, narrow leaves that have parallel venation, parallel veins. One main leaf vein, and of course the other veins run parallel to one another. So monocot flowers typically occur in multiples of threes. In other words, the flower may have 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 stamens, and a compound pistil with 3 fused carpels. We'll get to those terms a bit later, you all. And the monocot seeds have 1 seed leaf, 1 cotyledon. And the endosperm, of course, is that nutritive tissue is present in, of course, the mature seed. To contrast things, I'll now get on to the eudicots, which I'll just call dicots. Excuse me. The dicots includes things such as the sunflowers, blueberries, cacti, mustards, roses, and oaks. The list goes on, you all. Dicots can be either A, herbaceous, such as that tomato plant being an example, or B, being woody, such as that pecan tree or the hickory tree. Their leaves vary in shape, but are typically broad, meaning broader than that narrower monocot leaf. And these leaves here have netted or net-like veins. The flower parts occur in multiples of 4s or 5s. There are 2 seed leaves, 2 cotyledons, you all, and the endosperm is usually absent in the mature seed, having been absorbed by the 2 seed leaves during development. So let's get to reproduction. Well, before I get to that, before getting to reproduction, let's get to a table 28.2, to help you all with contrasting. I like this table. If I were you, I would copy this table down, print this table out, or do something to that effect. That way you could learn these characteristics. It's majorly important to everything we're doing here. Flower parts of monocots is multiples of 3s. It just says there's 1 furrow or 1 point in the pollen grain, which is, of course, microscopic, so I wouldn't necessarily use that on a test for testing purposes. What I will say is leaf venation parallel. Vascular bundles are scattered in the stem cross-section. I say again, the vascular bundles in the stem of a monocot are scattered, as opposed to the vascular bundle that you would see in the dicot, which I'm not there yet. So next up, I'm at the roots. There's a fibrous root system in the monocots, as opposed to what you'll see here shortly. The seeds of monocot has 1 seed leaf, and there is absolutely no secondary growth in monocots. To contrast, dicots have flower parts multiple of 4s or 5s. The pollen grain has 3 furrows or 3 pores, which I will ask about. Leaf venation, they have netted or net-like veins in dicots. The vascular bundles are arranged in a concentric ring or circle. The root of a dicot will be a taproot, T-A-P, a taproot. And there are 2 seed leaves, so there are 2 cotyledons. And then secondary growth is often present, unless, of course, it's a herbaceous plant. Much can be said about the same you see here. And I'll now get on into reproduction of the flowering plant. So if you use your textbook, you can see examples of these. I would say especially pay attention to what you see in figure 28.9, especially in figure 28.9 and 28.10. That's where I am now. Let us begin. Flowers are reproductive shoots. I say again, flowers are reproductive shoots, typically composed of 4 parts. These 4 parts, I say, are the things you ought to know about that basic flower structure. They are as follows: outside in, sepals, typically green; petals, typically showy, stamens, and carpels. So these are called whorls. These are the four whorls of a flower. So typical of which is to be at the end of a flower stalk, meaning is a peduncle. The peduncle is what the flower, I guess you could say, rests upon. What the flower rests upon. So to help you with what we just did, the last thing I'll get to is it may very well also be an inflorescence, meaning it may be a cluster of flowers. So I mentioned the term inflorescence in a later lecture, which you all will hear after this lecture. But what I'm getting at is that inflorescence is just a cluster of smaller flowers. And then thereafter, at the tip of which, you have the receptacle. And that would be where the sepals would begin to come out of that flower, and the area that's going from receptacle up to the ovary. But I'll say look at a picture to better get an understanding of that. So it's only the stamen and carpel that produces the gametes. And I'll help you out. Think of the stamen as being the male part of the plant, producing that thing called pollen, that male immature gametophyte. And of course, the carpel produces, of course, that one. I repeat, that single. I repeat, that one, class, that single egg. So other terms that are used in botany are going to be the term called complete. So a complete flower is one that has all four parts. You say what four parts? Sepals, petals, stamens, and of course that carpel. An incomplete flower is one that, of course, lacks one or more of those parts. A flower that has both stamens and carpels is perfect. I repeat, perfect flowers have both male and female parts. I'll put it that way. Both stamens and carpels. Make sure you know stamen and carpel. And of course, if that flower happens to be an imperfect flower, it has either stamens or carpels, but not both. So a flower can be complete and perfect, or perfect and complete, or a flower can be, of course, an imperfect flower that is not complete. Sepals, they make up that outermost whorl. And as I say it this way, those sepals in function cover and protect the flower parts when that flower is a bud, as it's developing. So as the flower opens, the sepals fold back to reveal those conspicuous petals. So all of the sepals together are known as the calyx. All those sepals wholly are known as the calyx. I'll go here and I'll just say get your what they call textbook out to follow me. So again, sepals, the outermost whorl, all of the sepals together are known to make up the calyx. It protects that developing flower. It protects that bud. And of course, it opens to reveal those showy petals. The next whorl then are, just as I stated, the petals. So the petals, they're typically broad, flat, and thin. They vary in shape and typically are showy or brightly colored. The reason they are showy or brightly colored is to attract animal pollinators. That is majorly important to know. Sometimes the petals are fused to form a tube, such as you would see with honeysuckle. The common name may be a Japanese honeysuckle, which you all may have indulged in as a child. And it could be another floral shape, such as you would see with snapdragons, with those two lips, which are beautiful, I say. So all those petals together form what is known as the corolla. So that is a petal, and of course that's another petal. And collectively, all of the petals make up the corolla. The next whorl in is the whorl known as the stamen. So stamens are made up of two parts. Well, first of which, it is the anther at the apical portion, and the thing that the anther is attached to is known as the filament. So the anther and filament make up the stamen. So it's at that anther where meiosis occurs. You say meiosis, you dang right I did. So as meiosis occurs, it forms those microspores, which will eventually develop into pollen grains. Each pollen grain produces two cells. One, of course, will divide, of course, to form those two male gametes, those two sperm cells. Class is giving you hints right here. One pollen grain will, of course, eventually form two sperm cells. and the other produces a pollen tube. I repeat, the other cell will produce the pollen tube to allow the sperm cells to travel to reach the ovule. Yes, I said that, to reach the ovule. And lastly, the most inner world is known as the carpel. The carpel, or pistil, as I say, either of the two. That's Pistil, the carpel or pistil. The pistil is here composed of three parts. It is that sticky stigma. The stigma is that receptive region for pollen, the style, the smaller region, and then ultimately you have the ovary. So it's that sticky stigma, it's the style, and ovary. Those three parts are what make up this female part of the flower. Carpels bear ovules. And to help you with that, the carpel of a flower, or the pistil of a flower, it can be a fused structure. It can be fused. So the female part, called the pistil, could be a single carpel, or it could be one that has fused carpels. So each of those contain the stigma, which I say again, that sticky stigma, for pollen to land, the style, that net-like structure, for the pollen to grow, and of course the ovary. And it's this ovary which will contain one or more ovules. So each ovule contains that female gametophyte, yes, I just said it, the female gametophyte that forms an egg. In addition, it contains two polynuclei, and several other haploid cells. After fertilization has occurred, the ovule will develop into a seed, and the ovary will mature into the fruit. So just make sure you take your time. Let us continue. So this shows, of course, I'll go to figure A. Figure A. So we have the sepals here, which are green and develop to protect the bud as it goes through development. As it opens up, it reveals those showy petals, keeping in mind that the pistils, well, I haven't gotten to pistils yet, excuse me. Keeping in mind that the petals are there and showy if in fact that flower is animal pollinated. Thereafter, the stamens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a multiple of 4, has to be a dicot. And then ultimately the pistil, the sticky stigma with pollen on it already. So now on to double fertilization. For this process, I'll say look to explain this on your test. I repeat, for the process of double fertilization, please look to explain this on your test. Let us begin. So the flowering plants, they undergo an alternation of generations in which the sporophyte generation is larger and nutritionally independent of that gametophyte generation. So for those that remember, which I hope you all do, that gametophyte generation in flowering plants is microscopically, and it depends on that sporophyte generation. So that's completely different from where we began in the 27th chapter with the bryophytes, because in bryophytes it's high, the green gametophyte is a dominant generation. Well, that's not the case here. Upon getting to the seedless vascular plants, the Gymnosperms, and now in the Angiosperms, we now have a dominant diploid sporophyte generation. So flowering plants like the Gymnosperms and other vascular plants are heterosporous, producing two kinds of spores, both microspores and megaspores. And indeed, sexual reproduction occurs in the flower itself. So keeping in mind, just make sure you all take time to review Figure 28.1.3, 28.13. It won't be on this test. However, on your final exam, you all will go through each and every portion of Figure 28.13. But of course, that is for the final exam. It's not for this test that's ensuing. So what happens here is each young ovule within the ovary contains a megasporocyte. That's that megaspore mother cell. And that is what undergoes meiosis to produce those 4 haploid megaspores. You have those 3 polar bodies. 3 of those will not do a thing. And then there will be one, I repeat, one that further develops into that mature female gametophyte called the embryo sac. So the embryo sacs, what they do is contain an approximate 7 cells with 8 haploid nuclei, and 6 of those cells, including the egg cell, contain a single nucleus. And a central cell has 2 nuclei, called polar nuclei. We're getting to the process of double fertilization, and I'm just telling you all where this is so you know where it comes from. So the egg and the central cell with 2 polar nuclei are directly involved in fertilization. I say again, the egg I just mentioned and those, of course, the cell with the 2 polar bodies are directly involved in fertilization. So as I say it this way, those other 5 cells in the embryo sac, they have no direct role in the fertilization process, and they'll disintegrate. So each pollen sac, or microsporangium, of another anther contains numerous microspore sites, the microspore mother cells, and each of those undergo meiosis to produce 4 haploid microspores. So every microspores will just develop into what is known as an immature male gametophyte, also known as a pollen grain. Pollen grains are small, and each of those consists of 2 cells, A, the tube cell, and B, the generative cell. So this should go back to where we just came from as I got to the stamen. So having gotten this far, the anthers split open and begin to shed pollen. Wind, water, insects, and other animal pollinators, which we'll get to in later chapters, transfer pollen grains to the stigma. That term class is known as pollination, the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma is pollination. So if, in fact, that pollen is compatible with the stigma, the pollen grain germinates, forms the pollen tube, and the process begins. So that germinated pollen grain with the pollen tube is the mature male gametophyte. So now we'll have 2 non-flagellate sperm. Notice I say 2 non-flagellate sperm will move down the pollen tube and then are discharged into that embryo sac. So as that happens, both sperm cells are going to be directly involved in fertilization. Hence the name, you all, double fertilization. So the 2 sperm cells that enter interact. So one sperm cell will fuse with the egg. As this sperm cell fuses with the egg, it forms a zygote. I say again, haploid sperm cell, haploid egg forms a diploid zygote that will eventually become that embryo within the seed. So that embryo in the seed will thereafter become that embryonic plant. The second sperm cell, sperm number 2, will fuse with those 2 haploid polar nuclei. So I think you find out where I'm going. You have this haploid sperm cell with 2 haploid polar nuclei. N plus N plus N forms that triploid endosperm, meaning that triploid cell, by way of those mitotic divisions, is what develops into the endosperm. And that endosperm is that nutritive tissue that's rich in lipids, rich in proteins, and carbohydrates that nourishes that growing embryo. In other words, that embryonic plant, that microscopic, that small embryonic plant, cannot photosynthesize. But what it can do is by way of imbibing water, by absorbing water, it begins active metabolism based on the endosperm. So the process of fertilization involves those 2 separate nuclear fusions. This is called double fertilization, and is with two exceptions, unique to flowering plants. So it's been reported to also occur in Ephedra, in the genus Ephedra, the gymnosperm, and another gymnosperm being nectar. Otherwise, the process is only found in angiosperms. And even the process in those two gymnosperms is different from the process I just explained here occurring in flowering plants. So let's go from seeds to fruit. As I get to it, this is that figure I mentioned moments ago. This is figure 2813 from your textbook. This is that figure that you all will find on your final exam. Of course, this chapter is not on the final exam, not formally at least, but this figure will be on the final exam, and you will label the parts and pieces shown here. You will label the parts shown here. So each seed contains a plant embryo endosperm, and both are surrounded by a protective seed coat, that multicellular seed coat. In monocots, the endosperm is that main source of food in the mature seed, as opposed to dicots, in which the endosperm is what nourishes the embryo, which is stored in its seed leaves, those cotyledons, the two seed leaves it has. So as the seed develops, looks amazing here, the guava fruit shown. As the seed develops, the ovary wall surrounds it, and of course, it enlarges and develops into the fruit. There are many other tissues that are part of it, and fruits do indeed protect the developing seeds from desiccation and aid in the dispersal of seeds. I have no idea how this happened in my presentation, you all. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about those X's there. So, as I say it that way, once a seed lands in a suitable place, it may germinate and develop into a mature sporophyte that produces flowers. The life cycle continues, as we've described it here. So keep in mind as I speak to life cycle. I know you say, "Huff, you just skip through it." Well, not to skip over or skip through it, but this, of course, is part of that diploid sporophyte generation. So from here, it speaks to both that anther and the ovary. So we have the microspores, which will eventually develop into, the microsporocyte, which will eventually develop into the microspore by way of a meiotic division. That means that microsporocytes are diploid cells, and by way of meiosis, they become haploid, the microspores, and then indeed develop into that immature male gametophyte known as the pollen grain. The same happens by way of the megasporocyte and the megasporangium. So what happens is that megaspore will be produced from the process of meiosis to give us that megaspore. So upon pollination occurring, then of course the pollen tube forms. Those two cells will travel down into that embryo sac. As those two sperm cells do arrive, they will continue down that pollen tube. There they are, two sperm cells. And by way of the A, egg nucleus, and B, those two polar nuclei, double fertilization occurs, going from what was once that haploid gametophyte generation to now being back in that diploid generation. So what we have now is that diploid zygote that has been formed, that triploid endosperm, and of course what is here is that seed enclosed within the fruit. So the embryo is there as well as the seed coat. As long as that seed has arrived to an area, as I just mentioned, that is suitable, it may germinate and form yet again a seedling, continuing the life cycle. So now I'll get to those evolutionary adaptations. So the flowering plants, it says they have an ecological dominance. What has helped them is seeds, fruits, and that endosperm. Hence, they're everywhere. So they co-evolved. I repeat, the flowering plants co-evolved with their pollinators. And this increases cross-pollination. It increases variation. It promotes, what I just said, is genetic diversity, allowing these plants to thrive and live everywhere on Earth. So the vascular systems with vessel elements and sieve tube elements increase efficiency. And finally, those root, the stem, and leaf adaptations allow plants to live, I would say, in a variety of habitats here on Earth. So what's so amazing is the way in which these plants can adapt their life cycle, meaning they can go through that sporophyte generation and inhabit those new habitats and changing environments. So this adaptability is what has allowed these angiosperms to live where they live and the way they live, such as the cactus is so well adapted to those desert environments by storing water, and of course the leaves or spines have that reduced surface area, and thereafter protects it from those, I guess you say, water-thirsty herbivores. The white cuticle is quite efficient in, of course, keeping it from losing water. And I mentioned the water lily before. It has air channels that provide adequate oxygen, and the stem and roots living in that oxygen-deficient water and mud. It's amazing how these plants live the way they do. So the botanist stated that those sepals are specialized leaves. Yes, of course. And the petals are modified. I repeat, the petals are modified stamens that, of course, became sterile and then leaf-like to attract, I say, in the respect of those showy petals. So what you're seeing here in A is that this is a carpel that's folded. I repeat, this is a carpel, and it looks just like a leaf in which the ovules are born. And then in B, you have a cross section showing the carpel. You have a cross section showing the carpel. So now get to the evolution of seed plants. So fossil evidence states that as this has occurred, meaning the evolution of seed plants, is that they descended from the Gymnosperms. And I hope that's obvious to you all by the way this course has been taught. In other words, we began with those first land plants, the bryophytes. From there we went to the seedless vascular plants, then to the Gymnosperms, and now to the angiosperms. So it was adaptation between the plants and their animal pollinators, meaning it's that coevolution that I would say began by way of, it says here, the beetles and certain gymnosperms, approximately 180 million years ago. Several gymnosperm lines existed, and with features resembling those of flowering plants. You're saying what parts? Well, leaves with broad blades. The first modified seed-bearing leaves. You know those cones? So they're not enclosed in ovules, but which nearly enclose them. And the beetles were visiting those plants, and it's been suggested that that relationship was the beginning of that coevolution, meaning that mutual adaptation between plants and their animal pollinators class. It's so amazing. So it's by those genetic studies and molecular analyses that indicates that conifers may be the gymnosperms most closely related to the flowering plants. So having stated that, I'll now get to the old fossils. So it's stated that the oldest fossils that are known appear to be from ovules enclosed in tiny pod-like fruits in the Jurassic and Lower Cretaceous rocks. So the oldest fossilized flowers are approximately 118 to 20 million years old. If that's not old, I don't know what old is. So yes, even then were flowering plants. And I said 118 million to 120 million, excuse me. From 118 class, this is a typo, it's 118 to 120 million years old. Now those are some very, very old flowers. And someone once asked, how long will that plant collection last? These plants were, of course, fossilized. So by 90 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, the flowering plants have diversified and begun to replace gymnosperms and were Earth's dominant plants. So those fossils of plants show, of course, leaves, stems, flowers, fruit, and seeds, which were quite numerous and diverse. They outnumbered, I repeat, they outnumber the fossils of gymnosperms and ferns in the late Cretaceous deposits, indicating the rapid success of the flowering plants as they appeared. So having done that, those are photographs of those. Those are the photographs of those fossilized plants. You see the same in figure 2817 on showing NA, that's Archaefructus. Archaefructus. And it's found in China. Excuse me, it's found in northeastern China and approximately 125 million years old. NB, that's Archaeanthus lindenbergi, which is thought to be lived at approximately 100 million years ago. Pretty amazing stuff, I say, to say the least. So I'll now get to the basal angiosperms very quickly. So the basal angiosperm would be those very first extant plants. So the first clade would be those, and to make this a bit simple, I'm just saying that these angiosperms came earlier. And it's by cladistic analyses that this happened, meaning looking at structural features and molecular analyses. So with that, this evidence just indicated that there were several different clades of those early diverging angiosperms. And next up would be the core angiosperms, which are divided into the three subclades, the magnoliids, the monocots, and dicots. To help you all with review, please see the comparison of gymnosperms and angiosperms. If you look closely, you all should see those needle-like leaves. You all should see cones. You say cones? You dang right I do. I say the ovulate cones, which produce what? Correct, seeds, as well as those staminate cones, which produce what? Yes, pollen. And here you see the angiosperm. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. So that has to be a eudicot or dicot. And you see here the seed, and that by way of the fruit when dispersed. So again, this is the figure class from your textbook, figure 28. What is that figure number? 28.13. That will be in your final exam to review the alternation generations of angiosperms. I won't review monocots versus dicots in such a way. However, this is something I would say you should review. I've already done this, but what's different is root diversity. On the far left, I'm showing you in photo a taproot. In the middle, I'm showing you the fibrous root system. Notice the difference. On the far right, I'm showing you all prop roots, or at least to the left, in a taproot, in the middle, a fibrous root, and on the right, prop roots. We'll do more with prop roots in the latter chapter. This is another depiction showing you all one seed leaf in monocots, the parallel veins in monocots, the scattered vascular bundles in the stem cross-section and flower parts, dicots, 2 seed leaves, the broad netted leaves or net-like leaves, the vascular bundles in a concentric ring in that stem, and the flower parts in multiples of 4s or 5s. Another depiction showing you all the very same. I place these here for your use, class. I'm doing this review because I say it should be something you all could see for learning's sake. As I continue, on the left is a dicot leaf, on the right a monocot leaf, well, 2 monocot leaves. This shows you early growth and the differences among the two, between the two being monocots and dicots. As plants germinate by way of seed, on the left you shall see that, such as the corn growing down my backyard looks exactly like that on the left. On the right, the dicots, such as the okra growing right now in my backyard, look exactly like that. That is, I say, the excellent, the most perfect way to know, is that really what you planted growing? This shows the very same. I'll give you all time on your own to review these, but of course, as I just stated, 1 seed leaf in the monocots. Notice, there it is, germination, such as the grass that I planted in my backyard. As we moved into the home, I planted grass instead of paying for sod to the builder. And when I saw what I just showed you here sticking up, I was elated because I knew that my grass had begun to germinate. Those showing the leaves, these are the scattered, I repeat, the scattered vascular bundles in the stem. And I'll move on to the next. So this is dicots. Notice, in every dicot on Earth, it looks just like this as it germinates. This will be on the ground. That will be the first thing to emerge. Then this, and you'll finally get those two seed leaves. Minute veins are there, the vascular bundles are there, and a concentric ring. The taproot is here, and the fibrous root is there, which I forgot to mention in the monocot. Take time, class, and review this. This will help greatly. Yet again, it shows much of the same. On the top is the monocot. On the bottom is a dicot. Again, I told you all I like pictures, so I'm giving you these visual depictions to make up for what was not in lecture, and since we did not have lecture, I'm making sure you all see this. Quiz yourselves. Flower A, monocot or dicot? Flower B, monocot or dicot? Please make sure you all justify your answers. A, monocot or dicot? B, monocot or dicot? Please justify your answers. Briefly, of course. And there it is. So this class has been the 28th chapter. Study well, prepare well. Thank you all for listening. And please take notes. I repeat, please take notes. That is the reason that these videos are here. That is the reason that these lectures are here, for your purposes of taking notes and not just listening. Thank you again, you all, and have a great day.